Well, good morning, everybody. It's
Good morning.
great to see you all here. I was thinking that we probably wouldn't have this many, so I'm delighted that people are here for Super Bowl Sunday, and it's a funky day as far as what we have to talk about. And I sort of have gone back 30 yards and punted in the context of the day, because I've added some content that I sort of had in the back of my mind but didn't expect to see when I chased it down. So I've turned up a Lutheran to talk about. And it turns out that in this context of American millenarian, utopian, set-aside communities, there's this there's this group that moves almost as much, it seems like, as the Mormons did. And they started out in Germany as Lutherans, and they got kind of sideways with the institutional church in Germany, and they got excited about what they thought they could do in America, just like some of these other groups did that had become imbued with the idea of this wide open frontier where anything goes, and they could go through and they could create their own perfect society based on what they believed. Well, what they believed came out to be in some ways even more bizarre than the other two that I'd already expected to blow your minds with today. So we've got a lot of weirdness to contend with in this particular part of the discussion that I've been leading up to. So today is Super Bowl Sunday. It's also Sex Sunday. So if you're ready to kind of dive in, what I gave you last week to read about was something that historians love to find if they can, which is something that's pretty close to the original documents, or something that at least gives you a feeling of what the people that were involved were doing and saying in their own words, instead of someone interpreting. And what I had kind of in mind for my role today originally was to try and interpret a lot of this for you, but there's too much. So what I decided I would try and do, and we'll see how this works, is to go off and give you some of the same material that I was working from, and see what stirs your passion, see what gets you excited as you look at it and you say, wait a minute, that can't be right. Or, I never heard that before. Is that really what they said? And let's talk about it, and then I can be more of a resource to you. I can go ahead and I can talk all day. I've got lots more presentations than we can possibly do in an hour or hour and 10 minutes, whatever we work with. So I thought I should at least set the stage for 3 groups, and then open it up to the handout from last week plus the handout this week that I just laid out in front of you. What this is cuttings from a variety of sources that I turned up, trying to get arms around probably the most famous group of the bunch, which is the Shakers. The Shakers have got the most attention, and it just astonishes me that they do. I think the real reason for it, but I can't say this with certainty, but I think the real reason for it, we're kind of a little bit of antiquers in our family. We kind of represent, Dan and I do, the antique appreciators, would-be collectors, if we had enough money to spend thousands of dollars on real original. Shaker furniture is known as the highest craftsmanship around, and much to be desired. I looked at at an auction for a single chair that was of this period, created by Shakers. And I'm going to guess this particular auction that I saw on YouTube, I think it was probably between 10 and 20 years old already, and the chair went for $1,000 plus. Just one single chair for, you know, like a kitchen table kind of thing. They're beautiful. They're highly crafted. Now, by the time they were done, the Shakers figured out they had a market here. And they started mass producing them. So, you know, you would need to be, if you're a collector, you would need to have a little discernment to look at this in order to tell one which was handmade and one which was cranked out a little bit that they did later on, because they learned techniques of mass production before. And that's one of the things that I didn't see coming, that all three of the far out millennial groups that are separate utopian communities that I want to talk about, all three of them managed some success at selling stuff. And they figured out that they could bring money into the community even though they had a totally different model internally from what we're used to. You know, I don't really know for sure that they thought of themselves as Acts 2 communities. And when they say Acts 2, see if that brings back to mind. What do I mean by that? What happens in Acts 2? Anybody?
Well, everybody sells all their possessions to the benefit of the group.
You're halfway there. Mostly they did sell in Acts 2, but the idea is they gathered it all together and they distributed it. So you've heard of Stephen ministry in this church. Stephen ministry goes back to Stephen being one of the Jews who had a Hellenistic background, and among this group, the Hellenistic Jews were feeling that they were not getting the same treatment. You know, Hellenistic are ones that were dispersed, ones that didn't come to the community specifically from Jerusalem, let's say, or the Holy Land to start with. They were still Jews in every way, but they had come in and they brought their stuff, and they didn't feel like they were getting kind of the same treatment. That's been an issue in modern day Israel too. Native Jews and Jews that are imported. Anyway, Stephen was assigned as the head of a group of, I want to say 7. I think I'm right about that, but I'd have to double check. To make sure that things were taken care of and that everybody got equal treatment. And so we kind of pick up on that. Stephen later went on to be the first martyr. What happened to him?
Martyr.
Yeah, he's the first martyr of Christianity. So in any event, all three of these communities that I want to talk about, the rap community, also known as harmonists, or the New Harmony, or Rapite community, they're taking that off the name of this guy who left Germany and became the leader of that group. George Rapp, we think of him now, his actual name is more Germanized than that, but in the anglicized American way, we look back and think of him as just George Rapp. And then Mother Ann Lee, who's the head of the Shakers group that starts up, that I'll talk about first. And then a guy by the name of John Humphrey Noyes. And John Humphrey Noyes is sort of connected to American royalty because his mother is like a distant cousin of the president. And he's one of these guys, I don't want to say he's a poor little rich guy because he doesn't quite fit that mold, but he's a mama's boy and he's got a problem because he's got red hair. And he doesn't think he's attractive to girls. And he gets kind of wrapped up about that. And the way he handles that before it's all done, I think is easy meat for a Freudian psychologist to play with. I think all three of these guys would be kind of fun to work a psychological study, and some have done that with Mother Ann Lee, but it's harder with her because what happened was she died pretty early in the process, and she could neither read nor write. So what we have is people chronicling what she said through their eyes, and in the process, as it spread out to 18 or 19, depending on which source you read, from different communities, they come up with some different thoughts, and you'll see some of that in the handout that I gave you today. So most historians, as they look at Mother Ann Lee, would say, well, it's worth it to maybe add a little grain of salt, you know, as you look at this. Maybe double check and compare it. So I'm inclined to accept what the more rigorous historians would say as they looked at it, but then I turned up this original source, or at least pretty close to the original source, and of all places, the National Park Service. The National Park Service turns out to be a gorgeous site. If you're an amateur historian and you want to look at these communities, because there's been a fascination, I think, and I want to tie it back, I think, to this desire for Americana, this desire to get back to, you know, where we started from, our roots and our furniture and our culture and our crafts and all those things of the 19th century. I think there's a fascination with it. So I think that's one part. I think it's inescapable to look at the fact that these three communities had weird ideas too. Now, they didn't think that they were weird. They thought that they had a corner on the truth. So since the central focus that I've been working with you on is, you know, what did these groups come up with religiously? What was their core set of beliefs? What turned them on? What did they want to share or spread? I've kind of focused on that, and so that's what today's handout is designed to give you a little bit more of. So, without a lot more ado, let's see if I can't go through some of this fast. I'm calling these folks radicals. In American political terminology, when you talk about a radical, it could be on the left or it could be on the right. Right to you, left. Politically. A radical is someone who's not satisfied with piecemeal change. A radical is someone who's looking to go to the root. The radical etymology of the word would take you to the idea of the root. So they want to change the root structure of things because they have a different idea of what's going on, or what ought to be, what ought to be the way things are organized. Now, I would say, don't get wrapped up in all the words, even though I've got a lot of words that are going to go on the screen, because we're capturing these for you, and Chris is preparing it, and at the end, we'll have it set up, and you could have a PDF of all of this. So we'll be able to hand that out, and we can post it in such a way. Chris has got enough storage to handle all of it already, so that you can download it really easily, and anytime that you want to go back and look at the slides that were here for these references, they'll all be there for you. But what this slide tells you is there's a bunch of these, and there's a lot of them that are aggregating in that part of the country that we know at this time as kind of the edge of the frontier as they saw it at the time. Remember, you know, we're just at the point in the beginning of the 19th century when the Louisiana Purchase is made. So the frontier is Pennsylvania. You know, they push forward to the Mississippi River with the Louisiana Purchase later on in the first quarter century, but they don't get it explored for a while. So it's really fascinating to me because I had not thought this through, that Pennsylvania and Indiana are going to be homes, as well as upstate in New York, for a lot of this fervor, a lot of this uproar with new communities. So here's the one that was new to me that I wanted to spend some, oops, don't do that. George Rapp, Harmony in Pennsylvania. George Rapp and his community moves twice. I'll talk about them real shortly. You've heard of the Amana Group. They're another outfit that has created a special competence. Nowadays we think of Amana refrigeration. You know, it's that same kind of idea. The Hutterites, you may have heard of. I'm not going to spend much time on them, but what happens is toward the end of the century, they get co-opted, and they kind of lose the religious connection. And what happens is the churches and the mainline groups start to pick up on the idea that the Methodists are putting out, that says it's more important, maybe that's too strong, it's very important to be engaged in society. It's very important to try and fix what's wrong. And what's wrong is serious stuff, because this is the time of immigration, this is the time of the Industrial Revolution, and this is the time of the growth of cities and teeming masses that are struggling just to get by. So you have what comes to be known, and I'll speak of it more probably next week, in kind of the concluding wrap-up of what's called social gospel. I'm sure that there are some people that would criticize Messiah to say Messiah is too involved in what's going on around and not enough involved in doctrine, not enough involved in what makes the church the church. Well, the social gospel idea is what makes the church is the kingdom of God is here now, and you're called upon to be a steward of that, and you're called upon to take care of your fellow man. Fundamental conflict in the way those ideas are viewed at that point. And I think if you were to push Bob or Jay, they would say it's not either or, but it's both and. Yeah. But at this point, what's going to happen at the middle of the century, 1848, is when Karl Marx writes the Manifesto. So by the end of the century, you have socialism as an idea morphing into communism, morphing into labor union unrest, and the desire of people politically to make a change. But in the meantime, we've had all of these groups that have been creating their own communities. Now, the point is raised here, and I think it's right, that says most of these communities were tied around some individual that had a lot of personal magnetism, a lot of personal strength that held it together. But when that person died, you know, the group sort of withered. That happens with 2 out of these 3, but with Mother Ann Lee, oddly enough, it's the opposite. they grow after she dies, and because she's done a good job of recognizing and deputizing people to follow her and declaring that this is my successor, they're able to spread. And they actually create not just one, but 18 or 19 of these communities. And they go all the way down. I read somewhere that there was a Shaker community in Florida. You know, so they're really widespread at this point. We showed you this one before. I just want to refresh your mind as we get ready to look at Johann Georg Rapp. This is pietism. There's kind of two ways to look at it, I guess. You know, the fellow that comes out of the Ligonier series that I've talked about before says that pietism is a mistake when it's an ism. Piety is great. Piety means you're emotionally connected, you're a believer, you're working to be true to the faith, and you are organizing or orienting yourself emotionally, spiritually, internally to devotion to God. What Stephen Nichols says is when you add an ism on it, you're looking at behaviors instead of beliefs. You're talking about how can I do stuff to get right, as opposed to how can I get right in my heart, in my mind, in my spiritual connection. I don't know if that's really the case or not. You know, I've met some people. I think I told you about one that I encountered that bothered me a lot the first time I taught anything in California, who didn't want to do Bible study because it was her approach to do devotional study. She needed to do it from her heart. She needed to do it from her internal orientation. And as a Lutheran, I'm a little suspicious about that, even though there's a lot of that kind of feeling, particularly in the Haugian movement in Norway. So we inherit a bunch of that. We inherit a devotional side, a spiritualist kind of a side, a seeker kind of side, if you will. That's not your average way of looking at things if you grew up Missouri Synod, though. If you grew up Missouri Synod, you got doctrine, and you knew where you stood, and you knew ABC, and yea, yea, it shall be so, verily, verily. You're not going to miss that. So some pietists here in Germany, and that's what George Rapp is, but he basically is going to cast off and quit being anything recognizable as Lutheran by the time he's done. What's he going to do? He's going to get rid of anything that sounds like or feels like the church. He's going to say, we don't need to be baptized right away. In fact, you shouldn't baptize until maybe age 6 at the earliest. Why?
Choice, the kid's choice.
Say again?
Choice, the kid has to choose it.
Yeah, and why does the kid need to do it? You're halfway there.
About it. He has to be taught.
It's something you do for...
Keep going. What's the idea about adult baptism as opposed to child baptism? What's the rationalization for it?
It's something that you do for God. It's not a gift from God.
Well, you're 3/4 of the way.
Look out.
Keep going. Help me
In
out
the
here.
final analysis, they're going to say, you need to be a believer to be baptized. You need to make your own confession. You need to make your own, you need to have some idea what you're doing. You know, baptism is from you to God. And so that's why I say you're 3/4 of the way, Terry. Because we would say, you know what, that doesn't have anything to do with it. You know, in the Lutheran teaching, there are 2 means of grace. What's a means of grace? That's the way that we get God. That's the way Jesus comes to us. That's the way that salvation is connected to us. So what are those two means of grace? One of them, we've got half of it when we talk about baptism. What's the other half?
Communion.
Communion. And those two are called,
Sacraments.
okay, what's the other one? It's the Word of God itself. So whether it's preached or whether it's read, we've got, for Lutherans, it's Word and sacraments. And George Rapp says, you got me.
You got me.
And yes, baptism is good, but it's good when you're ready. It's good when you know what you're doing, and you want to. Now, that's a big strain in Calvinism and Lutherandom and the early church of the I guess I'll say something like 17th century it starts. And the group that is primarily known for that kind of wrestles with that, Zwingli is kind of connected with this as opposed to Luther. These guys are called Anabaptists. All that means is adult baptism. It just means believer baptism, that's all. It means you need to know what you're doing before you get. So he starts out from that standpoint. And then he says, what's this stuff about confession? Well, we don't do that very much anymore as an idea that is a part of our liturgy in terms of going directly to Pastor Bob or Pastor Jay and say, I want to tell you about all the bad things I did this week. You know, I want to confess my sins so that you can give me absolution. That's something that Catholics still do, and they have institutionalized. We do it publicly as a church, as a part of the service liturgy. And George Rapp says, yeah, confession's important. Come to me. Tell me. Mother Ann Lee does the same thing. Come to me. Tell me. Or come to my deputies. And see, by the way, I learned a new word in this. You have elders who are male, who she sets up as her deputies. And then what's the female version of an elder?
Deacons?
Close.
Deaconess.
I've never heard it. An eldress. An eldress is a female elder. And eldresses are just as important.
How's it spelled? With a
D-R-E-S-S. I think there's two S's.
Yeah, two
Maybe
S's.
just one.
Oh, okay.
I'll have elder R-E-S instead
Okay.
of, yeah, same deal. So, here's George Rapp. This is a painting done by memory on him. What George is going to start down the path is, he's going to suggest that, like the seekers that we hear about today, you don't need the church to get knowledge of God. God can come to you direct. We'll help. I'll help you. But basically, this is personal, this is direct, nothing mediating it, nothing telling you about it. We don't want the church telling you about it. We want you to experience it by yourself. Oh, that's getting a little, what if I think God is different from what you think? You know, Earl and I might have a discussion, but I might say, you know, Earl, you're all wet because I have a private revelation here. And Earl would say, well, what about mine? You know, I had a dream too. So, in the general scheme of things, we call these folks mystics. People that have unique, significant knowledge that they're getting from other sources that gives them enlightenment. So here's his real name, Johann Georg Rapp. He decides it's time to get out of Dodge because my ideas are not, you know, being accepted. We're being persecuted here. We're being told not to meet. We're being told not to have services on our own. Let's go to America. Let's see if we can't make this work in America. And when they get there, I don't know if it's the Germanic spirit or if there's something else that worked out of this group better than average, but they got off to a terrific start once they started moving. And they created a society and a town in Germany. Now I'm going to give you the first bombshell right here. So, grab onto your seats. George Rapp is saying that when Adam was created, he was a hermaphrodite. Remember your high school biology? You know what a hermaphrodite is?
Yes.
That's an individual that has both sexes. So when Eve was created and pulled out of Adam, disharmony resulted. So how do you deal with that? Well, you would think it would be a natural kind of thing, it seems to me, to say, you bring them back together. They say just the opposite. You keep them apart. So the idea to create harmony somehow has to do with celibacy, which means no sex. Now, they didn't demand it, but they strongly encouraged it. And George Rapp's kid gets married, but he's one of the very last ones that I did that. Okay. He's one of the very last ones to do that. Now, what does that do to your group, by the way, if you don't have any kids?
Shrinks.
It dies out.
So you better have a pretty good recruiting arm to bring in converts, to bring in people that are going to help. They did, and they kept talking back to Germany to keep bringing in others. So Rapp's idea is also tied to the idea that we've talked about again and again and again about the millennium. All right, help me back here. Make sure you remember, what's the millennium? And when does it happen? What is it? You can get the MILL part, right?
That's 1,000, right?
Okay, the millennium in Revelation 20 is 1,000-year reign of Christ when he returns to earth and the believers share in his reign, in his power. It's a time of peace. It's the end of things before the new world comes down in the very last chapter, Revelation 21, and the new Jerusalem is created out of whole cloth from the old earth. So George and his buddies think it's about to happen. It's right around the corner. And one of the common things that they held in their mind's eye was, if there's going to be 1,000-year reign of Christ, then that, in their terminology, it's wrong, in my humble opinion, but that's the kingdom of God. So if the kingdom of God is about to break out, we should be ready to participate. How are we ready to participate? We should purify ourselves. What's the way you purify yourself in the Old Testament? You follow the law. And if you're getting ready to go into battle in the Old Testament, according to law, no sex. You purify yourself, you study the Word, you fast, you do the things that get you ready. So they're not adamant about it, but they're awfully strong. Now, he made a mistake, George Rapp did. He brought in Where is this guy? They brought in this guy, Bernhard Muller. And George Rapp was quite taken with this fellow and thought that he would be a good lieutenant. And it turned out that Muller thought he'd be a great king instead of lieutenant. So they kind of fought against each other, and Muller wound up pulling off about a third of his converts, and that was pretty much the end of the society. So they couldn't stand the internal dissension that broke out from having two power centers. But they were fabulously successful. And they built dozens of buildings. And look at this. This doesn't look like a mud hut, does it? This is where George Rapp lived. You know, they did all right. Now you'd need something like that in Butler, Pennsylvania, or in Indiana where they moved. I was telling Pastor Jay, the most fun part for me is why they moved the first time. So why they moved from Pennsylvania to Indiana the first time was because they couldn't grow grapes very well. Why did they want the grapes?
Wine.
So if we can't have our wine, we can't be living here. We gotta move to another place. So, fascinating story. They sold to a guy by the name of Robert Owen. You might have heard of him. He's more famous. He's a non-religious utopian, a socialist. If you go into most of the American dictionaries and you look up who represents socialism, and they'll go to Robert Owen. So it's another one of these ideas that says, let's get all together and let's share our property in common, and let's have the community run things instead of leaving it up to individual people. So they sold out because they needed to get more wine. Now, let's move over to the Shakers. Oh, that's not the one. Okay. Questions on George Rapp? All right, you saw this slide before. These are the other two leaders that I want to talk about and get you started with. Mother Ann Lee on the left, in uniform, and Noyes on the right. Sometimes you see him with a beard, sometimes without. What was common and what was different about them? Well, neither one of them liked the idea of having families. Mother Ann Lee had 4 kids, she lost them all. That's not uncommon in this time frame, but she viewed it as God's judgment on her. Maybe Phoebe Palmer did the same thing when she drove out and started the holiness movement. She lost 3 in a row. My great-grandpa, back in the old country, was one of, I think it was 8 kids that were born and died, and they kept giving him the same name over and over and over and over again. And finally my grandpa got the name and came to America and started things out. I had no idea that anybody would, that's like George Foreman naming,
Everybody's
all his kids George.
Everybody named George.
How could you do that? That doesn't work for me.
Not a good day.
So, what's wrong with the nuclear family? Well, they had different feelings, but, you know, as far as Ann Lee was concerned, this was a put down of women. This was an oppressive kind of a situation. You can understand that a little bit when you understand where she comes from and the time frame that she's working in. She's illiterate, she doesn't have any skills, and all she can do is what her husband tells her to do. That's the way it was. And so for her, sex and kids were bad news, and God punished her for doing it. So after the fourth one, she said, no more. And her husband says, wait a minute, I'm the head of this household. And she said, we're not sharing a bed ever again.
Well,
And
was
she
it,
made it stick.
was it was it having children that she was against, or marriage, or both?
She wasn't against being married to him, but it was a forced marriage. It was an arranged marriage. She was the daughter of a blacksmith, and while they're as nearly as I can tell, she did have some brothers and sisters, so it should have been possible for the business to be passed on, but for some reason it wasn't working. And so it was very common, I'm told from reading about this, that if you couldn't get the inheritance to work, what you would do is you would get your apprentice to take on the business for you, and you try and get the apprentice married off to one of your kids, so that way it would stay. So that's what her dad did. He said, you will marry him, you will stay, in this. So, and we worked in the clothing trade, and we're talking about getting the cotton from the plantations in southern America, from the slave states, coming in and being spun into cloth, and it's sweatshop work. It's backbreaking work. It's not fun. It's not a good life. So she's got nothing going for her until she discovers the Shaking Quakers. The Shaking Quakers are named that way because they not only quaked, but when they got started, their whole bodies would get engaged in the response to the Holy Spirit coming in. And they would shake all over, and they would get into gyrations that actually turned into some pretty bizarre, apparently, behaviors, and they made a lot of noise. And the neighbors didn't like it, because they didn't stop. Sometimes they went all night. So the British started putting them in prison and saying, stop it. You're not allowed to worship like this. This is crazy. We don't want to have this sort of thing. And while she's in prison, she starts having some more visions. She'd already been having dreams. She was afraid to go to sleep at night because of the dreams that she had. She dreamed she was wrestling with dragons and stuff like that. A lot of her dreams seem to have been inspired in some kind of way by the imagery of Revelation. So she was a serious student of the Bible. I mean, she read scripture, but like a lot of folks, she, kind of interpreted it in weird ways. And while she was in prison, sort of like the Apostle Paul, she made a bunch of converts. And people started following her. By the time she came out of prison, they were following her instead of the other way around. So she had followers by the time she was done. Now, John Humphrey Noyes is coming out of that point of view where he wasn't sure that he would ever have a sexual scenario with a woman, because he didn't think he was attractive. He thought he was bad looking because he had red hair. But he finally found, after he went to a revival that his mom made him go to, guess who the preacher is? Who we've been talking about as the outstanding preacher of the burned out district where he's from. Same guy. It's Charles Grandison Finney. And Charles Grandison Finney gets to him, and he gets converted. So he goes to divinity school. But while he's at divinity school, he starts hearing what the Methodists were talking about, and he says, yeah, I like that. The idea that you could become perfect here on earth by confessing your sins and getting right with God, that's a really cool idea. So just at about the time that he's to be ordained, he makes an announcement that says, I'm now perfect. I have converted, I have given myself over, I will sin no more. And they said, you know what, we're not giving you a license to preach. You know, that's not what we have in mind. So he winds up falling in love in a very traditional way, but he can't make it work. And the woman gets married to someone else, and he says, we have a spiritual marriage. It doesn't matter who you marry physically. I'm still married to you, even though, and today we would almost call it stalking, because he followed her wherever she went in terms of moving his household, as it were. He finally did get married. He finally found someone. He said, we'll have a spiritual marriage, but I get to have sex with whoever I want.
This is the same redheaded guy you're talking about? The same guy?
This is different, and it gets worse.
That's the same guy.
So he's starting to preach about this, and he's attracting friends. And he builds up a little group that could follow him. Okay, I'm getting ahead of the story here, but the long and short of it is, when he creates his community and his followers move to Oneida after they have to run away the first time, he says, and he means it, women and men are equal in all of this. They have an equal right to work, they have an equal right to dignity, and they are the ones who should take the lead in a sexual encounter. So he's not against sex. In fact, he says, sex is good. Let's have it. The only thing is, sex is good for the woman, but not so much for the man. And I'll talk about that in a second. Well, I got to talk about dancing a little bit, because as far as the Shakers are concerned, this is worship. When Mother Ann Lee sets up her community, nobody has any sex. If you're used to having sex before you come in, forget it. Because that's the first thing that you do, is you confess your carnal nature to someone that is an elder or an eldress or Mother Ann herself. And when they do that, the stories that when you read the reports of this, it's like people have a revelation. It's like they've unburdened themselves and they feel free. And they feel at home, they feel right, and they feel good, and they say, at last, I've dealt with this. And so what Mother Ann Lee does is she creates dormitories for the women and dormitories for the men, and the women sit on this side when they eat, and the men sit on this side, and she calls this, are you ready? A foretaste of the feast to come. Have you heard that language?
Yes.
Where do we use that language?
Communion.
Yeah. But that to her is what heaven is supposed to be like. Why? Because you've gotten rid of all that carnal nature, and there's no more put down, there's no more the man is abusing the woman by virtue of his strength or any of that sort of stuff. It's all equal. And if you come into the community and you do decide to participate, and you already have kids, that's fine. But you won't be raising them. They'll be done by the whole community, because we have to inculcate these values. You know, we want everybody to recognize, you know, that this is going to free you up, because if you have an idea that you want to have a career as a woman, fine. If you just want to work in the kitchen, fine. You know, whatever your gifts are, we need the labor, we need the contribution. But it won't be about child rearing. Someone else will do that communally. And so does John Humphrey Noyes does the same thing. So when they get together at worship time, it starts out a lot like a regular Shaker meeting, it seems like. And they might have some discussion, they might just sit there quietly, someone might get captured by the Spirit and might start talking in tongues, or you might not hear anything, but sooner or later they dance. Dancing is unto the Lord. And so they develop some elaborate steps. Now, we're not talking about slow dancing here. You know, we're talking about line dancing kind of thing. We're talking about doing this as an elaborate series of ritualistic motions together. And they keep going, and they get more and more wrapped up, and it becomes what's called ecstatic. What's that mean? If you're in ecstasy, what's happened to you?
That's really
Joy.
transported out.
Okay. So they get ecstatic, they get completely wrapped up in it, they get completely emotional about it, and they keep going till they drop. Literally drop. And so the fascinating thing about this, to me, is that as a recruitment tool for the Shaker communities, they put out the word that says, come on in, dinner and a show. We'll feed you, and then you can participate in our worship. You don't have to dance, but you can walk. And you can see how earnest we are about our faith. And you can see how we connect up. And if it moves you, and you want to join us, and you want to make your confession, and you want to turn over your property and give up your life to Jesus, we're here for you. And you can see that. And they do. People do come in, and they are almost always impressed. Now, it isn't in the literature very much, but once or twice it creeps in, and I submit to you that there's another purpose for the dancing. We do have some stuff that has happened in the past 20 or 30 years in the Lutheran Church that has included religious dancing. But we don't dance till we drop. We don't dance until we're exhausted and completely have lost it. We don't dance to be ecstatic. We dance to give artistic rendition of excellence and devotion to God. So if you're dancing till you're dropping, what else might be, what other purpose might be served in this? Think about the core that's going on in this. Think about the sex. I'll just give it out there. Think about the sex. Put sex together with exhaustion. What happens? Nothing. You know, if you're exhausted, you can't do it. You can't get on with anybody. So if you've got these ideas that, you know, we're going to sneak out and get outside the dorm and, you know, meet with Helen in the bushes later on, you can kind of forget that. It's not going to work. Not only do they have proctors in the dorm, but you're going to be too tired. I think the mere repetition of this exercise, plus you're working, serious working. The Shakers are more agricultural than industrial. The John Humphrey Noyes Oneida people are more factory oriented than agricultural. They still grow their own stuff and they're still very successful. But the Shakers at heart are more agricultural and more farmer oriented. I'm just saying. I'm just putting it out there. You can make of it what you want, but I think that's part of it. Okay. So, Foretaste of the Heavenly Feast, we did that. Both communities did a fantastic job of getting their people to build stuff. And so did the Rappites. You know, it's astonishing to me that these three communities created as much wealth as they did. The Rappites lasted 100 years. The Shakers lasted 100 years. John Humphrey Noyes and his boys might have lasted longer, except that John Humphrey Noyes had to run out of town because he was about to be arrested. So we'll talk about that in a second. So you look at their communities. Here's the Oneida structure. Here's the Shaker community. Very different kind of setting, right? Very plain, almost Dutch colonial, not a lot of ornamentation, but classic lines and attractive to look at. You look at the agricultural communities that they put together, and it's almost always fresh and clean looking, and you might say, I'd like to spend a weekend there. I'd like to go there on a vacation. And guess what? Indiana, New York, the places where these communities are, they're all creating B&Bs, they're all creating not full-fledged hotels, but you can go and you can stay there and you can experience it for a weekend. There are restorationist villages that are out there, and the idea that says we can go back and we can feel a part of America where it was, what it was like a couple hundred years ago. Very attractive, very well done. Here's Oneida. Here's what they're famous for. They didn't start out making silverware, but they wound up being very, very good at it. And it brought them a ton of money. They started out making steel traps. And those were very successful. So they became kind of metal workers around the way in terms of the big exports that brought them in a lot of money. And they brought enough money in from the flatware and the silver, and not just flatware, but all kinds of silver types of implements that they did really quite well, and they were able to sustain themselves economically without having a lot of new converts necessarily bringing in more property, so that there would be income from new converts. So the idea starts in all three of these communities that if you're going to join, everything you've got, you put on the table. You give it all. It might or might not be that you sell it, like we talked about for Acts 2 to start with, sell it and give the money to the central court. You might just bring stuff that you've got. But whatever you've got, it goes into the pot. But now they've got enough money coming in to sustain themselves as communities. And if you're ready for this, because the language is going to be a little jarring to you, John Humphrey Noyes calls it holy communism. Like that? How does that roll off the tongue, or how does that hit your ear? Is that something you're ready to buy into?
Well, probably not in today's world.
Well, again,
I mean, that, I would say that has a relatively negative connotation today, because we know what communism is.
That's exactly right.
But then I'm asking. So then was that
right.
Was there any?
It
negative
doesn't
to it,
have the pejorative attached to it because Marx hasn't been adopted and talked about very much. This is still beginning before Karl Marx. Now, by the time Oneida dies, Marx and the Manifesto has been around for 40, 50 years. So it's going to start by then. Now, just to fast forward and put something in your mind to be thinking about for when we resume down the road some point, when we start talking about the 20th century, communism is going to be hugely important for the evangelical community. And it is going to be dramatically important in Billy Graham's ministry. Billy Graham was a staunch anti-communist. And because we were so wrapped up as a country, he got a big boost from being in the right place at the right time with that message. That was huge for Billy Graham. Made a magnificent difference in his ministry. This isn't going to seem quite right. And I don't know that I'll have enough time to really do any justice with this right now, but stop and think for a minute. Think about the time that Jesus is being trapped, or attempted to be trapped, by, it's got to be Pharisees, because that's usually who's doing the job. And they say, okay, Jesus, here's this woman, her husband dies, she marries again, she has another husband, he dies, she marries again, he dies. When they all go to heaven, which one's her husband? Remember that? And what does Jesus say? He says, you guys don't know what you're talking about. That's not what heaven's like. And John Humphrey Noyes says, aha, it doesn't matter who you're married to. In heaven, everybody has sex all the time with anybody they need to. And then he puts that together with Genesis 6. Let me see if I can pull that up real quick.
Wasn't that like in the 60s and 70s and female? They were saying that. What you got?
That's not it. I thought it was Genesis 6.
That is it, read it. 6.
Well, it's pretty close to there. The Nephilim are presumed giants. And it may be Genesis 4, I'll have to go back and double check at some point for next week. But remember, just before the flood, there's an atrocity that happens that God says, I've had it with you guys. It's right after the Tower of Babel. You remember what it is? They're called the sons of God. They come down to the earth, and what do?
Commingle.
What?
Commingle with.
Not only commingle,
Have sex.
they go beyond that.
Have
They
sex.
impregnate
Everybody.
earth women. And the result supposedly is giants, Nephilim. And so John Humphrey Noyes says, not only does Jesus say it's not like you think about for standard marriage, but obviously people in heaven are having sex. Obviously. Because they're coming down and they're hitting on our girls. So the answer is, to John Humphrey Noyes, no marriage,
It does sound like this.
but sex.
Wow.
So you have one guy who says no sex, and you have these other people
Yeah,
that have
so you're-
500%
You
sex.
got 3 different points on the continuum here. So John Humphrey Noyes, it's gonna get worse. John Humphrey Noyes says, sex is good as long as you consent. So you can have it all the time you want, but no kids.
Uh-oh.
Uh-oh.
No kids.
Uh-oh. So, how does that work? Well, the answer is a practice that if you're male, you're not going to be too thrilled about. And the answer is you can't finish. You can't complete the act. The woman can do it all day long. She can have all she wants. Because unless the male finishes, there's not going to be any children. And we do not want children coming into this community. If you come in with kids, that's okay. We'll take care of them as a community. You will be freed up as a woman to do whatever you need to do, whatever you want to do. We're gonna have equality in this society. But, we don't want any new, oh, wait a minute, yes, we do. But what kind of children do we want? Only the good ones. So we will have a committee to decide who should have kids with who.
Really?
Now, I'll give you two guesses who heads the committee.
Ugly people don't like them.
But they're serious about this. Now, Terry's disqualified from the answer. Let's see if anybody else can get it. Has anybody ever heard of stirpiculture? Well, it's a word that supposedly John Humphrey Noyes has invented, but you'll get the idea. It's selective breeding. So you're trying to bring out the best. So it's kind of like you have a society, and you have people who are relative degrees of devoted, relative degrees of how with it they are in what this community is about. And those that are the closest to the community ideal ought to be the ones who are encouraged to bring their children into the community. Again, they're going to be taken care of communally. They won't be belonging to anybody as a parent per se. So, on the one hand, you have men can't finish, they can't have kids unless it's predetermined. So, how do you get to the point, if you're the average guy, where you can make this work for you? The answer is that it's an old joke, but I'll lay it on you anyway. Practice, practice, practice. That's how you do it. So, who teaches you how to do this? If you're a guy, women that can't have kids. So you have a selective group of women who are basically past menopause, and it's their job to teach the young men how to do this.
So then it's okay.
This is called something on the order, I won't have enough time to get there with it, but I think it's called ascending membership. Now, get ready, because this is not going to be as fun to hear. The second half of it, who teaches the women? Who teaches the kids?
The old men.
You teach the young ladies as soon as they're able to have kids, they're able to practice sex. So, around about 14, they're starting to be introduced into how do you do sex in this community. Who teaches them? Well, the higher level men in the society, of course.
Yeah.
Now, guess who's the highest of the high men?
The ones who choose who's on the committee, who can choose.
Say again, Kathy?
The people in the committee who can choose
Yes.
who can have
Yes.
sex and who can't.
Now, as an aside, suppose in this process, suppose that you have a man who's chosen and a woman who's chosen, and they think this is pretty cool. And they say, we'd like to sleep together for a little bit longer than just the amount of time that's necessary to create a child. They say, okay, but don't get too close. Because if you start getting too close, we're gonna separate you. Because there will be no marriage. There will be no cohabitation in the society. We're not gonna set up the barriers that the Shakers are doing. They're not gonna have dorm for the women and dorm for the men. Quite, you know, we might be room to room right next door to each other. That's possible. Because we're expecting you to discipline yourselves. We're expecting you to live according to,
Keep it physical, don't fall in love.
yeah. But if you're showing too much signs of maybe starting to build a relationship that might want something permanent,
Well,
you're
then what
gonna be
happens?
separated.
So what happens, can you eventually kick somebody out of the society or whatever?
Yes.
Really?
Dude, no, really.
And
Really?
about the only way that you got kicked out was if you wanted to get married. And that happened very infrequently, but it did happen.
Did they kick them both out? Did they kick both of them out, or
Yeah.
Just the
the
Well,
couple?
I mean, it wouldn't be so much kicking them out as they would volunteer. And the same thing
Well, they
happened with the
knew.
Shakers. Once in a while,
They had to go.
you get a couple that would say, you know, we are so attracted to each other that we want to spend our life together and we're gonna give up.
You see,
Now, would they take their stuff with them?
No.
No.
No, they could
That's
take
all-
their stuff,
that's all-
it's all community.
It's all
It's
community
signed
owned.
in the book and no.
Really?
Now, in George Rapp's society, if you decided to leave early and you hadn't contributed very much, they might give you a monetary gift and say, okay, see you, Godspeed. But that's pretty much it. Once you have joined these communities, you know, you're all in. That's it. Now, what I gave you to read that I wanted to talk about, so we'll have to do it next week, is think about the ideas that are going in here, particularly in the context of what Pastor Bob was talking about today, about belonging and contributing to each other and having a relationship with Jesus. Did you hear Jesus today? Did you hear me talk about Jesus very much today in this?
Jesus.
They're all saying, he's coming, he's around the corner, he's gonna be here tomorrow, we have to get right.
I didn't hear much.
Does this sound like church to you?
No,
No,
They called themselves churches.
no. Well, they didn't like socialism, but then they created their own government control.
Say again?
They've created socialism even though they weren't trying to do socialism. That's all government control.
Is this government?
Yeah,
On a small scale.
yeah.
They're all buying into it, they're not complaining, Earl. They're happy with it. That's what I want you to be thinking about in the context of what Pastor Bob was talking about today. They're happy. There's a guy by the name of Aldous Huxley that wrote a book called Brave New World. I used to teach it to my government classes, my social studies.
Yeah.
And I gave them their final question before we ever started. And it goes like this. Aldous Huxley's world is structured according to birth. You are created, you are shaped, you are built in the form of, you can only rise so much because the brain that you're given only has a certain capacity. And it goes alpha, beta, gamma, delta, and bottom of the rung is epsilon. And everybody's happy because they do what they're created to do. And this is what Plato talked about way before. Do what you are created to do. Jesus says, do what you are created to do. But what you're created to do is be in relationship with God. You are here to have a relationship, and you are here to be my magnet. You are here to show what it's like to be children of the Father. So my final question to them was, wouldn't you really rather be an epsilon? Wouldn't you really rather have this all settled for you so you didn't have to worry about it? Wouldn't it be great if you lived to your fullest potential all the time and nobody bugged you about, you know, why don't you grow up and be more than you are? Wouldn't it be great if you could be happy? Think about it. We'll talk about it some next week.
We have a closing prayer.
Okay?
The Bible.
Thank you.
The Vikings, yeah.
Yeah.
Merry Christmas.
Lord, we didn't open with prayer today, but we thank you for your presence. We thank you for your Son. We thank you for this day in this church. We thank you for all that you've done for us. We thank you for our pastors that call us to remember our relationship with you and our relationship with each other. We ask that you be with us now as we leave this place and bring us back safe next week to kind of close out a section where we think about all the different ways that people tried to get right with you and may have missed the mark. That's not to say that we've made the mark, Jesus, but we like to think that we are ready to hear you. So we'll be back, and you'll be back here with us, and we thank you for that. In Jesus' name, now we say, Amen.
Amen.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Holy moly. That was-